Hi everybody. Today we are going to cover Tokugawa foreign relations. This is something that I happen to study. My research is in the field of Tokugawa foreign relations, more specifically relations between the Russian Empire and Japan during this time period. And I'll be sharing some of my own research with you. And the reason I'm drawn to this topic is that I believe, and I'm certainly not alone in this, in that foreign relations were important for Tokugawa Japan, certainly because many important things happened that involved other countries in Tokugawa history, but even more so because foreign relations during this time period, or control over setting the boundaries of acceptable foreign relations during this time period, that kind of control was central to the legitimizing mission of the Tokugawa shogunate, or the legitimizing message of the Tokugawa shogunate. That is to say, by controlling who of their subjects and retainers get to talk to whom on the outside world and trade with whom and how, the Tokugawa regime kind of lived up to its image as the guardians of Japan and the Japanese emperor, because setting those boundaries, those, I guess, mental boundaries, even more than physical boundaries, between Japan and the outside world, that proved very important. First of all, it became clearer just what exactly the samurai could control and how they could control it, but also just by setting up that difference between, this official difference between Japanese and foreign, and getting the machinery of the government involved in mediating it, that could not help but increase the power of the government, and certainly the Tokugawa. And what the Tokugawa ended up doing by the 1630s, as a result of putting in place all those maritime prohibitions that we were talking about before, and kind of not only as a result of that, but also expressing some of the impetus behind those maritime prohibitions, was a notion, certainly officially designed and expressed, very purposeful notion, that the proper thing to do would be to recreate the Sinocentric world order, and recenter it on Japan. That is, to create for the Tokugawa an international framework where civilization was supposed to emanate from the center, in this case Japan, from the shogunate, who is borrowing the authority and prestige of the emperor, radiate outwards, and there would be these inner subjects, that is, the great feudal lords, the bannermen of the shogun, the samurai, and then around Japan there would be a zone of associated countries, as countries who would only be allowed to have contacts with Japan if their rulers somehow acknowledged the political and cultural superiority of Japan. And actually, maybe countries isn't the right word. Maybe lands is better. Of foreign lands whose people acknowledged Japanese supremacy in these ritual ways. And this really became, as I will argue, actually the basis for what was actually a very stable international system. This Japan-centric world order, in very many interesting ways, coexisted with the China-centered foreign relations system that country adopted. It led to a very interesting international system in Northeast Asia, where you have these two centers claiming universal sovereignty over, the whole world. It will eventually pay homage to the right emperor, Chinese and Japanese officials thought, and yet they managed to remain at peace. And this kind of foreign relations system, as I shall also argue, was successful enough so that until the mid-19th century, even Europeans in many ways found themselves paying homage to the Tokugawa, acknowledging themselves as subordinates in East Asia, and thereby the Tokugawa were very successful in part at ensuring peace and making this really the period of the Great Peace, in part because they managed to find an international formula that, or a formula for international relations, for foreign relations, that on the one hand enhanced their authority, but on the other hand provided a lot of room for informal compromise, just like their domestic system did. So in many ways, the way that the Tokugawa handled foreign relations was also based very much on the laws of Omote and Naisho, and negotiations between countries often resembled the negotiations between the shogun and his subjects, or between various daimyo within Japan. That kind of logic of interacting with people was one that was understood across East Asia. And it must be mentioned here that in the, well, as you've seen already, the pre-modern, or in this case, I guess the early modern, the Tokugawa period is early modern Japan. The early modern period of foreign relations really functioned very differently from the way that modern foreign relations functions. And as far as the Tokugawa were able to set the rules of international communication until the 1850s, then their authority was fairly secure. But once Western powers in the 1850s and 60s put pressure on the Tokugawa and forced them to alter their foreign relations system, as we shall see, this proves to be a great challenge for the Tokugawa, and actually a fatal. They don't deal with this challenge sufficiently well. The Tokugawa were certainly involved in the direct conduct of foreign relations between them and certain countries. They were also just as happy to delegate the power to conduct foreign relations to subordinates. As we shall see, the Tokugawa were content to let the sole daimyo of Tsushima mediate Japan's relations with Korea. Korean embassies would come to Tsushima. Sometimes they'd continue to Edo, sometimes they wouldn't. But basically this was okay because in this kind of a feudal system, the Tokugawa did not themselves have to do something if their retainers were doing it in their name. And as long as the retainers were careful to obtain Tokugawa permission before taking certain major steps, and were careful to preserve Tokugawa prerogatives and interests, to protect their interests, then this system worked very well. Some subordinates, like the Matsumai clan, as we shall see, overstepped their authority at times and were actually removed from their lands. But basically, this was also a way that the Tokugawa legitimized their rule. They didn't even have to themselves do something if their retainers could do it for them. There was no sense that local rulers were undermining the power of the Tokugawa to conduct foreign relations just because they happened to be involved in the execution of these foreign relations. I mean, this kind of a situation in the modern period would be relatively just kind of unthinkable. It's as if the governor of Michigan had been charged by the Congress of the United States to handle all foreign relations with Canada. That would just be just strange in the modern context. In the early modern context, in early modern Japan, that was perfectly fine. There were different kinds of ties between Tokugawa Japan and the outside world. There was trade, and then there was diplomacy. Trade could happen between private merchants coming from various parts of East Asia, and Japanese merchants, or even the Tokugawa official representatives themselves, if the Tokugawa allowed merchants from that country to trade in Japan. The two main powers who had these kinds of relations were with Japan were the Chinese and the Dutch, who in Nagasaki, as we'll talk about in the next slide, who got to live in compounds in Nagasaki and basically trade with official and private Japanese merchants, but whose governments did not officially enjoy diplomatic relations with Japan. And this was because in the early modern period, diplomacy in East Asia was never just about exchanges of information and coordination of actions across state lines. Entering into diplomatic relationships always involved some kind of acknowledgement of a relationship between a superior and an inferior party. Certainly that's the way it functioned in the Sinocentric system that Japan had now adopted, and so the Tokugawa were unwilling to acknowledge or to continue to have diplomatic relations with countries whose rulers, or with lands whose rulers, did not recognize the superior authority of the Tokugawa shogun. And as we shall see, this had some limiting effects. The Chinese certainly were unwilling to acknowledge themselves as Japanese subordinates, and thus they didn't have any diplomatic relations with Japan. But their merchants could still come and trade in Nagasaki. So that is a important factor to consider. Also, a theme that will emerge during today's lecture is that this foreign relations system was very flexible and also very stable. For over 200 years, it kept Japan out of a major international war. For over 2.5 centuries, really. And it also allowed for some negotiations behind closed doors, just as it did in the domestic political order of Japan, as I had already mentioned. So basically, even those countries who acknowledge themselves as subordinates to the Japanese, as we shall see, really got a lot out of that in exchange through informal compromise, and were able to preserve some of the basically meet some of their goals, and in many cases to preserve their independence, or in some cases to preserve their independence, formal independence anyway, which was important. Japanese foreign relations functioned mostly through what have been called the Four Gates. That is, there were 4 physical locations in Japan where relations with different kinds of foreigners could take place. And these were Nagasaki, most famously, Matsumaya, which you read about for last week when you were reading the Howell article, Tsushima, this island right here, and the Ryukyus, and Satsuma. So basically, Satsuma is this domain in southern Japan that is very powerful, and the Ryukyus actually aren't on this map. They start right here. As will become known, or as will become clear later, basically Satsuma controls this foreign, technically independent kingdom down here, which is an archipelago. So it's interesting that, it's interesting that a domain, which is technically not free to set its own foreign policy, actually the Tokugawa give them permission to go and conquer this Ryukyu kingdom. It's a fascinating story. And what I want to do is to give you a good idea of how this foreign relations system worked. I think the most logical thing is to go through these gates one by one and to examine them in detail. Let's start with Nagasaki. Nagasaki is unique. It's the only one of these gates that was managed directly by the Tokugawa shogunate. It was a city which was literally Tokugawa territory. It was under the administration of the Nagasaki magistrate, Nagasaki Bugyo, who was very much responsible for conducting many of the interactions between the Tokugawa Bakufu and Tokugawa licensed merchants and the trading communities in Nagasaki. And there were two trading communities, both walled off in separate compounds. One was Chinese, and the other was Dutch. Let's start with China first. The Chinese trade was by far the more important of these two, and actually the most important overall during the Edo period, if we consider profit and certainly bulk of goods shipped. No diplomatic relations with China. Certainly the Chinese emperor was not willing to recognize the shogun as his superior, and so the two sides kind of just agreed to disagree. They did not need to have real close diplomatic relations in order to live side by side peacefully. That is not to say that there were no contacts between Japanese and Chinese, even Japanese and Chinese officials. In this age of rickety sailing ships, many ships went out of control, and Japanese ships washed up in China and in Korea, and Korean and Chinese ships washed up in Japan all the time, and exchanging these castaways was actually a major concern of officials on both sides. And you also got a great deal of information about the outside world from these people, and they were just very useful. You can almost think of them as a early modern version of the internet, if you want to think about it that way. Just people randomly posting bits of information, having that information read by people in a different country who have never been to the country you're describing, and you kind of get a picture of what's going on in the outside world. Not an exact analogy, but I think you get the point. And anyway, the Chinese who did have most contact with Japanese were merchants who lived in a section of Nagasaki called the Tojin Yashiki. Basically, the living, the law, basically a district for people who were called Tojin. And that was shorthand for Chinese, but as became clear to the Tokugawa authorities as the Edo period wore on, is that many of the supposedly Chinese merchants in the Chinese quarter were actually not Chinese. They were from all over Southeast Asia, and sometimes places even farther afield, but the Tokugawa chose to ignore that. Basically, as long as these people identified themselves as Chinese in front of the Japanese officials, then they could do business in Nagasaki if they subjected themselves to direction by Japanese authorities and by official merchants, and kind of stayed quiet. And this was true of the Chinese merchants as well. The initiative for, or all of the major decisions involving the commercial interactions were made by the Tokugawa officials and then by Tokugawa licensed merchants. They kind of, the officials set the number of ships that could come to Nagasaki in every given year, in any given year, and the merchants, the official merchants, said what they wanted from China, and the officials, the Japanese officials, said what they wanted from China. And then whatever space was left over, the Chinese merchants were free to fill up with other types of goods. China was especially famous for exporting things like ginseng, but especially silk, luxury goods, books, and pottery. Lots of high quality pottery, during this period, and there was a market for that in Japan. So as long as the needs of the Tokugawa shogunate and official merchants were met, there was a degree of actually private commerce between Japanese and Chinese merchants. And the great daimyo all had representatives in Nagasaki who were kind of sent to take some of, well, just to basically pick out choice Chinese goods and buy them for the daimyo. It was a rather large amount of trade. The goods that Japan exported were initially silver and then copper, as copper deposits became discovered and developed. But two things happened. First of all, the supply of both of these metals began to dry up around the end of the 17th century, the start of the 18th century. And also there were many samurai who were very unhappy about this. Many officials were basically saying, what? We're just sending all of these precious metals out of the country. They're not going to come back. We get tea, we drink the tea, there's nothing left. So eventually alternate exports were developed. And most of these were marine products fished out around Ezo. And we've seen how important Ezo was from the Howell article politically, and we'll talk about that also during the next slide when we talk about Matsumaya. But Ezo was also a major engine of the Japanese economy because it produced a ton of dried sea cucumber, dried seaweed, some other marine products, fertilizer, and these dried scallops as well were much in demand in China. And these were bound up into bales, into so-called tawara. And so the name for these goods became tawaramono, bale things, bale goods. And these bales of tied together marine, just basically sea products, were exported to China. And there was a lot of demand for them in China. Sea cucumber is an aphrodisiac, dried scallops are a luxury ingredient, and everybody needs seaweed to cook, and the kind to be gotten from Ezo was especially good. And so the Japanese did find an export substitution item that allowed the Nagasaki trade to generate considerable revenue for the Tokugawa, but also for private merchants, and to keep Japan supplied with a number of rare goods that they may not be able to get elsewise, especially medicines. Chinese medicines were irreplaceable in the Japanese medicinal culture during this time, and so they continued to import those. Trade, the volume of trade with China overall went down during the Edo period, but it always remained significant. And these Chinese merchants and these people, pretending to be Chinese, they were usually not allowed outside the gates of the compound. Although, of course, in Edo, Japan, whenever there was a law, there were always exceptions to the law. But basically, the city of Nagasaki came to them for delivering food and all kinds of services, including prostitution. Prostitutes could and were encouraged actually to go into the Chinese quarter and come back out, so that the samurai, thinking what they thought about the need to channel male sexuality, that made a lot of sense to people like them. And the Chinese quarter was, as I said, large. It was several thousand people, could hold several thousand people, and the population in there fluctuated over time. The same couldn't really be said for the Dutch. The Dutch lived on Dejima. If you remember the picture we saw from an earlier lecture, it's basically a fan-shaped artificial island in the middle of Nagasaki Harbor that is not very large. I forget exactly how big it was, in terms of the actual measurements, but it was basically the equivalent of one square city block. And the Dutch were expected to stay in there, just as with the Chinese quarter, services came to them, including food and prostitution and fuel and all of these other things that the Tokugawa allowed them to have. And the Dutch were controlled fairly strictly. If you remember the discussion about the maritime prohibitions, they had to perform this ritual of fumie, stepping on a Christian religious icon to prove that they are not Catholics and won't try to convert everybody. Their movement was certainly very restricted. As time went on, especially during the late 18th and, really during the early 19th century, some residents of Dejima did get permission to regularly go into the city of Nagasaki, and some actually gained the permission to live there. But really, these Europeans were thought of as inherently dangerous because they were associated with this crazy continent of Christians. So the Dutch also sent an agreed upon number of ships, and the quantity of this trade really declined during the Edo period. Sometimes it was not even one ship a year, and the volume of the trade was really quite small. But the goods that did come into Japan in this way were very, very important. Manufactured goods, including all kinds of scientific implements, and especially eyeglasses. Dutch eyeglasses were very, very popular in Japan. Books, as we've seen, anything from anatomy textbooks to histories of George Washington and things like that really did find their way into Japan and were studied by the authorities to get a sense of what was going on in the outside world, and also by these Dutch learning scholars. This was a strategic window onto the outside world. There was no official diplomatic communication between the Netherlands and the Tokugawa court. But this is one of my favorite points about this lecture today. The relationship between the Dutch and the Tokugawa was actually very complicated. In some ways, the Dutch were regarded as vassals of the Tokugawa. What do I mean by this? I mean they were literally recorded in official Tokugawa documents as people who performed obedience to the shogun and were therefore vassals. There is a compendium of Tokugawa foreign relations documents compiled by official scholars of the Neo-Confucian Hayashi clan, which we talked about at the last lecture, which is a compendium of all official documents related to foreign relations with commentary that the Tokugawa government went through in the course of doing business with foreign peoples. And the Dutch are included in a section, basically they are categorized as vassals because they had certain obligations to perform in front of the shogun in exchange for being allowed to trade there. These were not relations between the Tokugawa government and the Dutch government. These were a set of working arrangements between the Tokugawa and the Dutch East India Company, which operated this Dejima factory. So one of the things that the Dutch factor, that is the chief of the Dutch factory, which was basically the word for this trading post at Dejima, one of the things that the Dutch factor had to do was occasionally, usually during the ascension of a shogun, and then for a set number of years, and it varied, the number of years they were expected to do this was adjusted from time to time. But basically, what were they expected to do? These Dutch factors were expected to be conveyed to Edo in order to appear before the shogun and pay their respects and congratulate the shogun if there was cause for congratulations. And this was basically a version of what the Tokugawa had their own retainers do in the course of fulfilling their alternate attendance obligations. You go to Edo when the shogun calls you, you appear before the lord, and you kind of ritually validate the system in which you are living. Well, the Dutch were doing the same thing. And when the Dutch factor appeared in front of the shoguns, some of them could be quite cruel. They could make the Dutch person or people, if they happened to be two of them, they could make them dance and howl like monkeys. They were expressly ordered to do this on a few occasions. And this, of course, I think is to show a kind of a cultural disdain for these barbarians. And they were recorded then as having performed this feudal obligation. So in some ways, it's very interesting that there's a fascinating research about this issue by a scholar named Adam Clulow. I highly recommend you check out his The Company and the Shogun, which talks about this issue. But really, it's incredible. A Asian power is incorporating a European power during this early modern period as a vassal. And this is very different from the usual story that we hear about Europeans during the early modern period and into the modern period, basically building gigantic intercontinental empires by taking over local peoples and making them subordinate. Which is, that image is there for a reason. And I think it's very remarkable that in Japan, something almost approaching the opposite outcome is happening, especially if we consider how militarily backwards, behind the Europeans, the Tokugawa are. And by the mid-18th century, it's clear that they are very much lagging behind in cannon technology, in ship design, and in tactics. Nevertheless, diplomatically, they do quite well during this time period. Part of the joys for studying this issue for me.